Okay, so what I'd like to do now is take a bit of a detour and bring in another Germanic, since he was Austrian, culture morphologist named Franz Borkenau. And this is his book here. It's called End and Beginning. This is an ex-library copy. And it's subtitled On the Generations of Cultures and the Origins of the West. So rather than focusing on the disintegrations of cultures, he focuses on their origins. That's sort of his specialty. There's a picture of him here. There's Mr. Borkenau and the title page, End and Beginning. And he is thoroughly influenced by both Spengler and Toynbee. And he's read them both. He's also read Freud and Jung, as he was a competent mythologist, in addition to being a cultural morphologist. And this collection is not exactly a unified book. It's someone has edited this together. It's a whole collection of essays, Thinking Beyond Spengler, Toynbee and the Culture Circle, The Rise of the I form of speech, which is a great follow-up to Spengler's idea about the rise of individuality as it's in the West, as it's reflected in language. That's an excellent essay. It's just packed with great stuff in it, and he's almost as erudite as Spengler or Toynbee. So he's quite good. I'm quite fond of this collection of essays. He started out as a Marxist, and the only other two volumes that are available in English are books by him, early books that are Marxist. But I think he left that behind. And so what I want to do here is read his essay, The Antinomy of Death and the Culture Generations, because we're at the point in the introduction, in Decline of the West, where Spengler is talking about the importance of the disposal of the dead and how it differs in different civilizations and what the differences mean. They always signify something. And so what Borkenau has done here is he's created a model based on sort of combining Spengler and Toynbee and taking over Toynbee's brilliant model, which I think is absolutely essential, that Spengler missed completely, but that is absolutely essential in understanding these high civilizations, which is the three-stage generational model where Toynbee says there's a first generation of civilization, and it is composed of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and there are two satellite civilizations. Mesopotamia's satellite civilization is, of course, the Indus Valley. Egypt's satellite civilization is, of course, Minoan Crete. And all of that corresponds to the first generation of civilization. Three of those are riverine civilizations. Note, both Mesopotamia and also Egypt and the Indus Valley are all riverine. They're riverine-based. Minoan Crete is a novelty. It's the first oceanic civilization, and it's opening the doorway to the coming of the Mycenaeans and then the Dorian Greeks, who will be the next oceanic civilization. So civilization will gradually shift from the riverine civilizations over to the oceanic ones in the West. That's the first generation. The second generation that comes in after them is the one that is marked by the Indo-Aryan invasions, and which produces the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Persians, the Hindus and the Chinese, across the board there, all philosophically inclined civilizations. And then we have the third civilization that comes out of what Toynbee called a chrysalis. The Hellenic civilization becomes the chrysalis that gives birth to the Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization, what Spengler calls Magian. That's the third generation of civilization, along with what Toynbee called the far western Christian civilization, and which Spengler terms the Faustian civilization. Those are third generation civilizations, and perhaps Russia will be a fourth generation, as Spengler seems to think. So what he has done here is that he's got this idea about the antinomy of death that pendulates back and forth between each of these civilizations. And in the civilizations, in the first generation of civilization has an attitude toward death that Borkenau calls death transcending. of which Egypt for him is the paradigmatic case, in which death is everything. The afterlife is lit up. Everything in the civilization is devoted to feeding the afterlife, lighting the afterlife, conserving the afterlife, lighting it up. And he says this also applies to the Sumerian civilization to a lesser extent, but also to the Indus Valley and to the Cretan civilization. Although in this essay he doesn't say anything much about the Cretans or the Indus Valley. He has an essay after this where he talks about the Cretans. So that's a death transcending civilization. And then he says after that, the second generation of civilization with the Greeks and the Hebrews in particular is merely death accepting. They don't care much about the afterlife. The underworld becomes for the Jews Sheol, a dark place that they would prefer not to talk about. The Greeks don't care much about it either. The underworld becomes, in Homer, the realm of twittering shades and ineffectual ghosts. It's not a fun place to visit. So they have this sort of death-accepting attitude. But then in the third generation, with Christianity, it swings back to death-transcending. With Christianity, the afterlife is everything. The afterlife is the big thing that they begin to celebrate, just as the Egyptians before them had done. And a great deal of Christian theology came out of Egypt, out of Alexandria in particular. So back the pendulum swings to death transcending. And then with the rise of the far western civilization, especially during the Renaissance, it swings back then to death accepting. The afterlife becomes of negligible interest in our Faustian far western civilization, until finally we get all the way at the end of the cycle. Our modern attitude toward death is death denying. We deny the soul, we deny the afterlife, we deny that anything even remotely connected with the afterlife exists. A total mistake, as I've spent my career showing everybody. That's just dead wrong. It couldn't be more wrong. So that's a huge mistake that the West has fallen into as the result of this belief in the religion of science. It's a total mistake. Okay, so what he does, though, in this essay is he starts with the idea of the primitive societies who, he says, have a death paranoia. Primitive societies, and of course that's not a politically correct term. Nowadays we would call them aboriginal. He's calling them primitive, so we'll stick with his nomenclature. Primitive societies, before the rise of these high civilizations that Spengler celebrates in Decline of the West, have this attitude toward death called death paranoia, which is to say that there is no such thing as an accident. There's no such thing as accidental death. If someone dies, it's because a shaman somewhere has put a curse on them, or because they have violated a taboo, or because there has been some magical rite that has been passed that has put a hex on them, or whatever it is that happens to be the case. There's always this idea that death is not a natural thing that's accepted at all. It's basically denied. He calls it death denial here, but he also calls it death paranoia. I think death paranoia is the better phrase. And he's talking about the Paleolithic, but also the Neolithic, and he makes a huge mistake here because lumping those two together does not work at all. The Paleolithic attitude toward death might be death paranoia, since the hunting cultures of the Paleolithic are indeed cultures ruled by shamans. The shamans are the primary religious figures. They are feared. Everyone is scared of them. And so death paranoia works very well probably for the Paleolithic, not so much in the Neolithic. There's a burial that typifies the difference. As everyone knows, I've studied the history of these burials in quite a bit of detail. I have YouTube videos that go through this, in which there's a Natufian burial. The Natufians are from Palestine. They date 10,000 BC. They're transitional between the Paleolithic hunters and the Neolithic agrarian societies. And you find this burial of a shaman woman that is buried with all this accoutrement, lots of animal parts and bodies. She's deformed, as shamans often are, just as smiths later are in later traditions. But on top of the grave, they have put very huge stones on top of the grave to make sure she doesn't get up out of that grave and bother people. It's so there's a death paranoia there, very much so. There's a fear of the dead in shamanic dominant societies, hunting cultures, no question about that. When you get to agrarian Neolithic cultures, the attitude is totally different. They're not afraid of the dead. The dead, and this brings in headhunting, cannibalism, and sacrifice, all of which is a matter of the myth of the one who in illo tempore gave his life, had his head cut off and planted in the ground, and plants grew up out of it. We eat those plants, and the whole myth is enacted in killing some hapless victim, some sacrifice to enact the myth. But the dead are cozy. They're not. Nobody's afraid of the dead in an agrarian society. They're quite cozy. When you look at them, they have skulls everywhere, skulls and bones. Everyone has done anything they can to get a hold of the skulls of the dead ancestors. At Jericho, 9000 BC, they've decorated all the skulls, put lime plaster over them and cowrie shells in for eyes to reanimate them. They want to talk to the dead. They want the dead involved. And so there is no death paranoia when it comes to the agrarian societies. It's I don't know what you would call it, a kind of death affability or a death inclusion. I'm not sure what you would call it, but Borkenau has missed the difference between the two societies. However, I think what he's got here, as far as the high civilizations when they come in, the riverine cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and he especially focuses here on Egypt, is quite good and quite correct. So what I want to do, I don't want to read this whole essay, but I do want to read parts of it. He starts off with this idea of 5 theses on the sequence of high cultures. And he says here, 1, each high culture starts with a myth, stressing one side of the antinomy of death. And by the way, the antinomy is the antinomy that I must die, but I'm immortal. So that's an antinomy. Which is it? Are you going to die or are you going to be immortal? The different cultures stress different aspects of the antinomy. The culture ends with a rationalization, seeking to assert the opposite side. Ancient Egypt began with the most magnificent unfolding of the belief in immortality. Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten, ended with its total denial. He's 100% correct there. It begins with the celebration of death in the afterlife, all the wonderful pharaonic burial pyramid cults, and then we get this bland culture with Akhenaten, who is the Socratic man, as I've pointed out, in ancient Egypt, who denies all of that, denies death, denies the afterlife, denies funerary cults. He's the first nihilist, pretty much the first nihilist in history, as far as I can tell. 2, all high cultures of one culture generation, that is the first, the second, the third, are passing through the same cycle. Mesopotamia, Crete, and the Indus Valley show the same cycle as ancient Egypt, though in a much weakened form. The phases of the unfolding of the antinomy are thus tied not to individual cultures, but precisely to those bundles of cultures, the culture generations. So he sees a kind of horizontal view across the map of the different cultures that are in existence at the same time, share a kind of similar mentality toward death. 3, each successor culture, what Toynbee called affiliated civilizations, begins with a primal myth corresponding in content to the rationalizations of the late phase of the preceding culture generation, and logically ends with a rationalization corresponding in content to the primal myth of the preceding culture. Because what happens is with Akhenaten, there's a rationalistic mentality that he brings on stage. His religion is a rationalistic religion, and it's based on a denial of death completely. He's not interested in the afterlife whatsoever. And so the culture that comes after him, the Greeks and the Hebrews, pick that attitude up. They too are not interested in the afterlife either. 4, between successive cultures or culture generations, there frequently lie barbaric phases. These are what Toynbee called heroic ages, the great ages of the sweeping and clearing of a stage. That's the function of the barbarians. They come in and they sweep up the mess left behind by the disintegrating detritus of the previous high cultural civilization. characterized by a partial relapse into the death paranoia of the late Stone Age. So they actually, when the barbarians come in, they relapse to death paranoia from the primitive societies. This is especially evident in the Germanic, the Eddas, in the Siegfried stories, in which there's always suspicion about who killed who. There's always a constant paranoia. There is no such thing as a natural death amongst that family saga of the Siegfried world. But the inversion between the preceding and succeeding cultures described in Thesis 3 with regard to the content of the Antinomy of Death takes place as if no such barbaric interlude had intervened once a new civilization comes along, or generation. Finally, 5, within the history of high cultures, the death antinomy runs through a cycle comprising 2 culture generations, starting from death transcendence, generation 1, and passing through death acceptance, generation 2, back to death transcendence, generation 3, and so forth. Okay, so I do want to read his description here of generation 1, which is focused on Egypt. The rise of death transcendence in the great riverine civilizations. This is mainly focused on the evolution of the idea of death in Egypt. On the threshold of the high cultures, the analogy with primitive tribes surviving in the present can no longer help us. There is no present culture that would correspond to the state of primitive cultures at the moment of their transition into the first high cultures, the great riverine civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. We have to rely on historical sources, but those are still quite inadequate for the critical transitional stage, the pre-dynastic and early dynastic phase of those river cultures. Only the pyramid texts and analogous Sumerian sources yield information of the kind needed in our context. But in them, we encounter no longer the beginnings of the high culture, but its first climax. We thus know next to nothing about the end of the persecutory paranoia of the last primitive stage. We merely know that in the course of the decisive millennium of transition, the fourth before Christ, so 3500 BC, right in there, paranoia radically lost its central role in the spiritual life, even though it did not disappear completely. The emergent first type of higher civilizations does not mark the end of death denial, or death paranoia, but it corresponds to significant changes in the underlying assumptions. The burial rites disclosed in the pyramid texts still imply Pharaoh's direct ascent to heaven without passage through death, but Pharaoh, although human, is also a god, and genuine immortality is now vouchsafed only to demigods, such as rulers and heroes. The paranoiac witch hunt of the death-denying tribe has thus become superfluous, for Pharaoh is certain of direct immortality, and so are, though somewhat less explicitly, his Sumerian royal opposites, while all his subjects are equally certain of extinction. Mortality is socially stratified, perhaps the only point where religion and society are wholly merged. In part, this stratification relates to the more powerful mana of the ruler, in part to his greater material means for obtaining adequate burial. The aristocracy, too, although excluded from direct immortality, can, through mummification, achieve a species of immortality after death. Only the fellahin, unable to arrange for adequate burial and unknown to the gods, is denied all hope of an afterlife. So it becomes the question of, in the Old Kingdom, in the first few dynasties, the afterlife was the exclusive prerogative of the pharaoh, at least the ascent to the circumpolar stars. Then later, toward the end of the Old Kingdom, the nobles want it too. They start getting it, and then it gradually becomes democratized to anyone who can afford mummification. So then it becomes a matter of expense. If you're rich enough to afford it, we'll take care of you. On this basis, we see a new, no longer paranoiac culture, comprising an urban agglomerations and a centralized bureaucratic state, incomparably larger communities than ever before, and spurring them to achievements never before envisaged. We understand that this comparatively sudden jump from small tribe to great state, from agriculture and livestock raising to the planning of magnificent projects, would not have been possible unless the universal, self-destructive, persecutory mania separating man from man had been overcome. We also understand, despite the absence of historical documents, the main factor in the process of the overcoming of that mania. The young high cultures are distinguished from even the highest primitive cultures by the fact that they accept the certainty of death, thus uprooting the delusion that every death was due to black magic, and at the same time liberating an incalculable amount of psychic energy that had hitherto been used up by the struggle against the realization of the certainty of death. That energy is now flooding into the great effort of building the high culture, a great sacrifice. Probably the greatest ever made by man in his history was not made in vain. Recognition of the necessity of dying shows to man, in a degree not hitherto imaginable, the way to an improvement of this world, and within this effort, specifically to the perfection of substitute satisfactions, for the finally abandoned belief in an eternity down here. It is no accident that the rise of great art dates from that decision, and that art is linked so closely with the hitherto unknown striving for posthumous fame. In truth, provision for material existence becomes the basic principle of the newly created hydraulic bureaucracies and attains a scale never before imagined. The revolution in the condition of existence linked to the acceptance of the certainty of death affects ideas about life after death rather less than most other realms. The basic principle of preserving the dead body in the grave, as if he were alive, is taken over from the late primitive stages and merely perfected, like other fields of activity, by the rapid increase in technical competence. Absurd procedures like ochre painting are replaced by scientific methods of preservation, culminating in mummification. Now, the rise of mummification, it does have, like everything else in Egypt, it does have an evolution that essentially begins, the earliest begins, the phase one, it begins in Nakada in Egypt with a fellow named, the archaeologists have called Ginger, 3500 BC, and his body is buried in an oval pit. It's not mummified. There are no bandages or resin-soaked linen on him. The corpse is on the left side, facing east, and note that this tradition of burying the body on the left side goes all the way down to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When you see big statues of the Buddha lying on his deathbed, he's always lying on his left side. So that goes all the way down. So he's lying on the left side facing east. The body is in direct contact with sand, and so the bodies are well preserved. And so I think that mummification in Egypt just comes out of this natural idea that when you bury a body in that dry sand, it naturally mummifies. The sand dries out the skin, and it never fully rots. The skin of Ginger is still on that body. You can pull up a picture of him on Google Images if you want. He's lying there, and you can see that mummification was a natural thing that came out of this idea that burial in the direct sand is a natural, dries out the skin. It's a natural mummification process. So then we have dynasties 1 and 2, 3000 BC. Egypt is up and running, and the body now becomes insulated from the sand by wrapping it in hides, matting, and sticking it inside a box-shaped wooden coffin so that the pharaoh is in there lying on his side with his legs pulled up in a fetal posture. So that's a natural. He's still not wrapped in linen yet, but he's wrapped in hides and matting. It's not until Dynasty 3, the great dynasty of the pharaoh Zoser, with the first, and Imhotep, with the first of the pyramid complexes, where the corpse is now laid out flat, and stone sarcophagi begin to appear. The brain is left undisturbed, but they get into all the viscera and pull it out. And the mummy ends up resembling a kind of statue where they wrap the arms and the legs separately. So there's no real evidence of mummification directly in the Third Dynasty, but we have the rectangular coffin, and there are embalming tables at the Zoser complex, so that suggests that they probably were mummifying them. We just don't have any evidence for it at this point. And then with the 5th and 6th dynasties, finally a coating of fine plaster is added to the outer wrappings. And in the first intermediate period, the body is completely wrapped finally in a cocoon, the classic mummy. Not until the first intermediate period. The classic mummy in a cocoon of linen in a rectangular coffin that is carefully painted with the coffin texts. And it has 2 eyes on the side so that the ka can see outward, with a little door next to it so the ka can move back and forth. And then it isn't until the Middle Kingdom, the 11th dynasty to be exact, that we get anthropoid-shaped coffins. So that's sort of briefly the evolution up to the Middle Kingdom, the evolution of the mummification process. You can see that it's a gradual process of solving the problem of how to preserve the mummy for what Spengler would term the will of Egyptian civilization to preserve the body into the future, to preserve it forever. So that's the kind of technology that Borkenau is referring to here. And he says that a share of total social labor that is still incredibly large by modern standards is devoted to tomb building and tomb cults, a symptom of the still felt pain of the only recent renunciation of the faith in immediate this-worldly immortality. Yet, the consequences of that effort are quite unexpected. The preservative effect of primitive burial rites might have been credible up to a point, as long as nothing else was known or feasible, but the early stage of the high cultures invents deliberately organized material progress, striving from summit to summit of technical perfection. As it devalues the primitive in general, it also devalues the ancient methods for keeping the dead body alive. How can an expert on mummification feel anything but contempt for a practitioner of ochre painting? But the very devaluation of the primitive substitutes for aliveness raises the question of what kind of substances would really be sufficient. Is the mummy really more alive than decayed bones? The tremendous breakthrough of the reality principle, expressed in the new control over nature and society, cannot arbitrarily be stopped at any point, not even at the edge of the grave. The problem is immediately sharpened by the new structure of society. Primitive societies know only rudimentary class differences, apart from a mild form of slavery. The early riverine civilizations are based on the extreme exacerbation of these differences. Mummification is a privilege of a thin upper stratum, big tomb buildings that have a tiny group of kings and territorial lords. But if doubt begins to arise, even with regard to those highest techniques of preservation, it is completely obvious that all those who cannot afford those techniques are damned to eternal death. Ever since mankind began to make this worldly and otherworldly provisions against death, absolute death was never accepted, except for the enemies devoured by cannibals. Now immortality becomes a class privilege, and the struggle for the right to a life after death, the first demand of the lower strata. I think we can hear some of his previous Marxist emphasis on class differences leaking through here. In fact, as Breasted has shown, democratic insurgence against the class privileges of immortality occurs a good deal earlier than any corresponding movement for social leveling in the material sphere. The class struggle manifests itself first on the plane of religion. The popular deities, who gradually encroach upon the royal house gods, derive their credit from their power to provide immortality for all. In the course of a gradual transition, the belief in direct immortality dies out, and with it the solar tombs of the pyramid type. In its place arises a more and more elaborate image of a better world beyond the grave. Ritual remains the precondition of survival in the beyond. Man can still die an absolute death where due ritual has been neglected. But with the growing democratization of belief, insistence on right moral conduct in this world, and here I want to highlight this, right moral conduct in this world becomes a requirement for positive immortality, while the concept of a negative immortality, hell, appears for the first time. And this is, of course, the judgment of the dead, which, as I mentioned in my previous video on the evolution of Egyptian theology, corresponds on Spengler's charts with the Puritanism phase of Muhammad, Pythagoras, Muhammad, and Cromwell. The judgment of the dead comes in the middle of or at the beginnings of the Middle Kingdom. And it's a new emphasis on right conduct, moral conduct, being a big key to where you get slotted in the afterlife. The judgment of the dead with the weighing of the heart against the feather of Mot on the scales. This is a form of Puritanism. Recall the lines from Milton, who was a Puritan, from Milton's Paradise Lost, where he says, "And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all upright hearts, before all temples, the upright heart and pure." He even mentions the heart, the upright heart, as the key thing. And so it is also in the weighing of the dead in Egypt in the scales, the heart has to be weighed against the feather. And that heart better not be heavier than the feather or you're in trouble. By the time that stage was reached, the belief in immortality could maintain itself only if separated from the material preservation of the corpse. That separation is, again according to Breasted, the core of the spiritually and socially revolutionary cult of Osiris, which is victoriously advancing in the declining phase of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. It teaches that not mummification, but just conduct during life assures a blessed immortality. So, not just the magical power of mummification, now there's an ethical emphasis when the Middle Kingdom emerges out of the ruins of the end of the Old Kingdom. Now there's an emphasis on right conduct. You better be behaving, you better not sin against Mot, as Akhenaten later will do. And from the introduction of the moral point of view, it follows inescapably that the main contrast to the blessed immortality is no longer, as in the faith of the pyramid builders, absolute death as punishment for non-ritual burial, but hell, the immortality of the damned. The belief in immortality is thus freed from its class character. It relies directly on the soul's inner certainty of its immortality and expresses it consciously in a completely new way, while devaluing the continued physical existence of the corpse. In its most developed form, the Osiris religion gets very close to the idea of a purely spiritual soul whose fate in the beyond depends on its conduct in this world. The new prayers for the dead in the Osiris religion are based on the solemn assertion of immortality, like the old pharaonic rituals of the pyramid texts, but now take account of the fact of death. Side by side with a qualified death denial, there arises a qualified acceptance of physical death, anterior to the choice between heaven and hell. Those later Egyptian rituals thus represent the first pronounced attempt at a synthesis between the two basic contradictory attitudes towards mortality. Out of the mutual limitation and qualification of death denial, or death paranoia, and death acceptance, there arises a new concept which accepts death, but also aims at transcending it. Yet, the synthesis proves unstable. The moral requirements treated as prerequisites of positive immortality are really quite extraneous to the basic idea. The myths concerning the afterlife and the rituals attached to them consequently degenerate into scurrilous attempts to deceive the gods as to the deceased moral conduct on this earth. The burial cult does not vanish either. Only its heroic forms, embodied in pyramid building, disappear and are replaced by more modest, generally accessible forms. It is thus illogically preserved side by side with the belief in a judgment of the dead. There's the judgment of the dead. The ritual itself loses prestige with the growth of rationalism. The religion and the arts bound up with it grow shallow. Rationalism is on the way. As Spengler said, the Socratic man shows up in every one of these civilizations at one point or another, and rationalism begins to gain the ground and undermine piety and undermine tradition, undermine religion and spirituality. And Akhenaten is the man here. He corresponds to the Buddha, to Socrates and Voltaire. Those contradictions seem to reflect two factors: the gradual weakening of the mythopoeic creative force, which takes place in every culture cycle on one side, and the effect of the social descent of certain religious ideas on the other. The first of those two factors refers to the insight first formulated by Schelling, later reformulated by Spengler, on the basis of a more comprehensive knowledge of the variety of cultures, that the beginning of each culture cycle consists in the formation of some basic communities, people, states, churches, the culture as a whole, whose emergence rests on the simultaneous right of certain myths indissolubly linked to them. Conversely, it follows that the basic myth of a culture can only arise at its beginning and gets weaker in the course of its development. It slowly becomes, as we have seen, the archai slowly becomes semantically depleted over time, until rationalism gets hold of them. Until finally a phase of enlightenment almost completely suffocates it. The term myth is, of course, not intended here to deny the objective truth, content of the ideas concerned, which may vary from one case to the other. In the case of Egypt, the cult of the sun and the belief in the god pharaoh's rise to it, objectified in the building of pyramids, were such archetypes dominating the Egyptian culture cycle from its mythopoeic beginnings to its enlightened end in the sun cult of Akhenaten. Aha! The Socratic man now. The Osiris cult represents a middle phase of that course that follows the first profound shock to the basic myth. In such a phase, the new myth the judgment in the netherworld, no longer has the strength to replace the old one, the cult of the tombs and the rise to the sun. Rather, the old continues to exist side by side with the new, and their contamination leads to a progressive devaluation of both. The void thus opened must then be filled by pragmatic and rationalist ideas. For the myths which constituted the original social hierarchies lose their power to convince, with the double consequence that on one side the social hierarchies themselves are shaken, as happened drastically at the end of the Old Kingdom, and on the other, the arising new social orders are no longer legitimated mythically, but practically and morally. The resulting merger between a weakened myth and a morality which is sanctioned by it, but is practical and egalitarian, can be found in some form in the middle stage of every culture. On the point, the Western Reformation may be said to correspond to the Osiris Cult. As disbelief in the effectiveness of the burial cults deepens, the moment comes for an at once spiritual and social revolution that is lacking in no culture, the short-lived but portentous attempt by the pharaoh Akhenaten to abolish all the death cults and destroy their priesthood and to replace them by the worship of the sun. Not the actual sun, which rises and sets, but a fantastic, ever-shining sun which destroys all chthonic gods of the dead. Its exclusive worship would have meant nothing less than the radical denial of life after death. The revolution failed, like all such revolutions, due to its incapacity to overcome the mythological legacy, half dead as it already was, and the hierarchies linked to it through their vested interests. The end was a mechanical return to the old myths and cults, and ossification. The culture never recovered from the damage that the nihilism of Akhenaten did to it. That was the swan song of Egypt. This cycle is not by any means limited to Egypt, or even to Egypt and Mesopotamia. It appears to be generally true of civilizations that they terminate with a concept of death opposite to that with which they started. This is hardly surprising. Every culture attempts some synthesis between the two extremes sketched earlier. But no synthesis lasts forever, because no solution could do away with the simultaneous presence of two incompatible inner experiences. But when a particular synthesis breaks down, the pendulum, having in the meantime swung from one extreme, death paranoia, to a compromise with the other, death acceptance, does not return to its starting point. In our above example, such a return would have involved a revival of the old pharaonic death cults, which had in the meantime become wholly incompatible with the new forms of social life. The tendency is rather for the pendulum to swing wholly to the opposite extreme. In this case, the abortive experiment of founding a new religion exclusively upon acceptance of death as final. And so we see then that Egypt begins with a death cult that is based on death transcendence, with the pyramids, with the pharaoh ascending to the stars, the ray cults coming in with the emphasis on the sun, the Puritanism of the judgment of the dead in the Middle Kingdom, and eventually declining to the banal rationalism of Akhenaten, the first nihilist who has no belief in life after death whatsoever, and sterilizes the culture. And Egypt begins at that point to slowly fade from existence and decline into a series of fixed stereotypes that never further evolve again. So what we'll see in this next chapter is there's a partial during the transition to the second generation. There's a regression to a barbaric dark age, and death paranoia comes back before the Greeks. Moses, let's say he puts it, before Moses and Homer come in and pick up where Akhenaten left off by denying the afterlife and having little to no interest in it whatsoever, with what Borkenau calls death acceptance.